in Socialism 2019, Fight Imperialism. And so far, it's been all the sessions have been excellent, and I'm sure this one's going to be the best of all. Okay, so Fight Imperialism, Hands of Venezuela, Cuba, Central America. Now, I've been so busy, what I neglected to do is find out which order these speakers would like to go in. So while I'm reading out your names, talk among yourselves to see which order you want to be in. So anyway, what the speakers are: Maria Paez Victor, and she joined the Law Commission of Ontario Board of Governors in 2012. Dr. Victor is a sociologist born in Venezuela, educated in Caracas, New York, Mexico City, England, and Canada. She has 20 years national and international experience in policy analyst and environmental assessment, with particular focus in the areas of health and energy. She is an active member of the Latin American community in Canada, a leader of the Luis Real Bolivarian Circle, and a member of the Venezuela Solidarity Coalition in Toronto. And we have Bob Lyons, who is a prominent figure on the Canadian left. He is a former NDP member of the Legislative Assembly in Saskatchewan. Bob Ailes from Nova Scotia, not Newfoundland, Costa Rica, where he coordinates solidarity work for Socialist Action Canada in Central and South America. Okay, and we have Eve Engler, born in 1979 in Vancouver, is a Montreal-based writer and political activist. In addition to publishing, having 10 books, 10 books published. English writings have appeared in the alternative press and in mainstream publications such as the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Ottawa Citizen, and Ecologist. His 2009 book, The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, was shortlisted for the Quebec Writers Federation Mavis Gallant Prize for Nonfiction. His other works includes A Propaganda System, How Government Cooperations, Media and Academia Sell War and Exploitation, Canada and Africa, 300 Years of Aid and Exploitation, and The Ugly Canadian, Stephen Harper's Foreign Policy. His latest book is Left, Right, Marching to the Beat of Imperial Canada. And then we have Jeff Mackler. A damn warrior, man. Go Raptors, go. Okay, so Jeff is the National Secretary of Socialist Action USA, a longtime teacher militant, West Coast coordinator of the campaign of Free Mumia Abu Jamal, and a national steering committee of UNAC, the United Nations National Anti-War Coalition. And like I said before, I don't know who wrote this, but you'll all hear it again, despite being a very shy, soft-spoken person. Jeff is the Socialist Action candidate for President of the United States in the 2020 election. Okay, so now that you've talked amongst yourself, who's going first?
This way. Just like
The way you're sitting. Okay, Sister, you're on. You have up to 15 minutes.
Can you just announce that Eve's books are on sale back here?
Yes, I'm sorry. These books are definitely on sale back there. Yes, they are. Okay. Go ahead.
you can take the mic out.
Is this the mic? Is this
Yeah, but you can raise it if you want. If you want me to raise it, I can try and raise it.
There are empty seats in the second row and the first row.
Oh, lovely.
Get it closer there. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah?
Turn up the volume a little bit.
Oh, thank you so much. That's great. Thank you. And thank you all for being here today and for your fine solidarity to the peoples of Venezuela, Cuba, and Central America. My comments here today will center on Venezuela because that's what I know best. But make no mistake about this. The struggles of the Venezuelan people today, as it was in the 1800s, will define the destiny of the region. And I do not exaggerate. If the empire destroys Venezuela as it is today, it will immediately go after Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. And these are their words, not mine. As well, the struggle of the Venezuelan people to maintain the Bolivarian Revolution will determine in great measure the triumph or failure of socialism as a viable alternative to savage capitalism. So what is old about imperialism? Well, the violence, the ruthlessness, the lies, the breaking of the laws, and to get the elites on side. We in this room have all been witness, except those of you who are very young, to the destruction of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and almost Syria. These countries were invaded by the USA empire and its allies under casus belli, afterwards proven to be false flags. That Afghanistan was responsible for 9/11, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, that Syria used outlawed poison gas against its people. None of these countries were socialist or democracies. With Venezuela, the empire has two objectives: to steal its natural resources for sure, but also to destroy any semblance of socialism. The plot was the same: defame their leaders, say that the world was endangered by these governments, that democracy had been assaulted, that there was a humanitarian obligation to protect their own people. Therefore, military intervention was the solution. We're going to save them by killing them. It was not a coincidence that these countries were either rich in petroleum resources or were key in the flow and transportation of petroleum. International laws were willfully ignored and contravened, and or the UN was duped with false evidence into allowing military force. The consequences, as you all well know, were the deaths of millions of people in the Middle East, the devastation of the infrastructure of these countries, millions of people displaced who, fleeing the violence and the chaos, tried to reach nearby countries and ultimately Europe, causing a refugee problem of epic proportions, such that gave rise to xenophobia and the extreme right in Europe and North America. The situation in Central and South America has had different characteristics, but the USA has the similar plot. Historically, after the independence of the region from the Empire of Spain, the USA stepped into its place under the guise of a more indirect but equally heartless and unjust oppression. First of all, the Monroe Doctrine unilaterally declared Latin America the exclusive purview of the United States. Even today, deluded senators have been making reference to this outrageous doctrine as if it was self-evident. Second of all, Theodore Roosevelt's carrot and stick doctrine led the USA to oppose every single one of the enlightened progressive governments or leaders in the region, and it included at least 80 invasions or ousting of said governments with the collusion of local elites that received any carrot offered for their betrayal. The USA and its lackeys, its allies, foremost amongst whom is our beloved Canada, considered the USA's own front yard, have backed to the hilt every single despot and regime whose government with impunity trampled human rights. And it has been done by dangling that carrot before the eyes of Latin American elites who historically have always been willing to sell their birthright for the proverbial plate of lentils offered by the powerful nations. They were partners to the Spanish Empire. They opposed Simón Bolívar's Patriot Army of Liberation, and they are now shameful partners in the vile economic and financial war against their own Venezuelan people. Unbelievably, but it is true, the leaders of the Venezuelan opposition were the initial instigators of the economic war now besieging Venezuela. The elites are engaged in a desperate class struggle, textbook class struggle. They are instrumental in trying to destroy the tools of integration of Latin America, CELAC, UNASUR, which of course the USA and allies have opposed from the start. And now, with the collusion of the right-wing governments of Colombia, Paraguay, Ecuador, Chile, Brazil, they have been able to deal serious blows to the integration infrastructure of the region. So, what is new in imperialism? Well, first of all, the death throes of a decadent empire. What has happened in the world is what the environmentalists for decades predicted. Predatory capitalism with its insatiable consumerism rampant industrialization, and appalling individualism has catastrophically depleted natural resources, has polluted nature, has degraded with impunity key ecosystems, has increased animal extinctions, and has, along with all of this, increased economic polarization and a social injustice worldwide. As Pope Francis I has stated in his remarkable encyclica, Laudato Si', he says, "How can anyone claim to be building a better future without thinking of the environmental crises and the suffering of the excluded? Both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effect of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest." So, uncontrolled capitalist expansion has meant the increase and constant use of raw materials, and these come from nature, nowhere else. And what is new is that these raw materials are increasingly more scarce, and they are located overwhelmingly in the developing countries, most particularly the raw materials that are absolutely essential for today's advanced technologies: petroleum, oil, gas, precious minerals, coltan, and the rare earth minerals. North America and Europe doesn't have any of this. It's us people in the South that have it. There is a document that clearly shows how the Europeans, unable to shake their imperial outlook, see the situation as if they, and only they, have the right to these resources, no matter where they are. I'm going to read to you how the EU defines environmental risk, and they're referring to developing countries. In this report of the European Commission 2010, they talk about the critical raw materials. Environmental risk, according to Europe, is defined as the risk that measures might be taken by countries with the intention of protecting the environment, and by so doing, endangering the supply of raw materials to the European Union. Did you get that? That's the environmental risk, that the people in the South will protect their environment. This they will dress up as barriers to trade, freedom of commerce, etc., thus masking their imperialism in its most stark manner with ideological platitudes backed by the misuse of law or lawfare. As for the USA, well, there are too many instances to refer as to how they persist in their manifest destiny ideology and believing that Latin America and the Caribbean belongs to them. But just one quote suffices. On July 2017, a private briefing with the intelligence officials, President Donald Trump asked why the USA wasn't at war with Venezuela, noting that they have all that oil and they're right on our back door. A second thing that's new about imperialism, they're trying to revive the past. Trump, a belligerent and deceitful man, has surrounded himself with cruel warmongers like Bolton and Pompeo. And the convicted war criminal, Abraham, never forget, Abrahams was responsible for the anti-communist death squads in Central America. That should be written up in the sky like they do with planes. This man was a convicted war criminal. All are working to oust President Maduro, to destroy the Bolivarian Revolution and more. And based on their infamous experiences in the Middle East, in Yugoslavia, in Kosovo, in the Ukraine, and almost Syria, these satanic warmongers of the White House are trying not just to overthrow the Maduro government, but are engaged in an effort to actually dismember the very state of Venezuela. They want to redistribute it according to the corporate interest of the USA oil industry, the Canadian mining industry, and the bordering lands for their stooge governments, Colombia, Guyana, and Brazil. Venezuela is battling not just for a government, not just for the Bolivarian Revolution, but for the survival of the very state itself, of the integrity of Venezuela. This group of war worshippers have put the Trump regime into a Cold War time warp, even to the point that Trump has declared war on the concept of socialism itself, threatening from the podium of the UN, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. It is Cold War deja vu. But a word on the pathetic role of Canada, although my colleague here will tell you much more about that. But under the direction of a Cold War wannabe warrior, Chrystia Freeland, a right-wing ideologue, she is opposed to anything that smacks of socialism. She has plunged this country into a den of thieves run by corrupt governments who self-appoint themselves as the Group of Lima. Freeland has rounded up these usual suspects of corrupt and anti-democratic governments so that she can please both the bully in the White House and get the crumbs he dispenses, and please the murderous Canadian mining lobby that salivate lusting for Venezuela's gold and diamonds. She has disgraced this country and done perhaps irreparable damage to its international standing by continuing to support the violent, anti-democratic and vicious Venezuelan opposition. I hope to live to see the day in which she is hauled up before the International Criminal Court for her hand in the crimes against the Venezuelan people.
Hear, hear.
But it is a losing battle for Trump because you cannot eradicate an idea, an ideology so bright, so widespread, so creative, so prolific as socialism. So good luck to him. Today, when the workings of the market are so erratic, so hurtful to the vast majority of peoples throughout the world, when the capitalist system is showing its enormous clay feet, threatening not just social stability and social justice, but life itself on this planet, socialist experiences, laws and projects are gaining more and more acceptance even in the belly of the beast, which is the USA. And as Marx so rightly exposed,
3 minutes.
and like a prophet, he said, capitalism has within it the seeds of its own destruction. Its overwhelming expansion and unbridled greed is demonstrating more authoritarianism and bringing it down. And I'll talk very fast. The new powers on the block is another thing that's new. The USA is no longer the only superpower. It can no longer think that its bully power will succeed. We are witnessing the rise of the multipolar world, where emerging nations are coming into their own self-governance, where Russia and China are showing extraordinary economic power, especially in the international markets. And furthermore, both have demonstrated such diplomatic and political wisdom that their leaders are now viewed with a new respect. And Russia and China have proven to be true friends of the Venezuelan people, helping them in this dire hour of need with food and medicine and especially international support. This is even more valuable considering the erratic ramblings of a lying US president that cannot be believed and cannot be taken seriously except for the fact of the military power that he is horrifically in command of. So what is new is that Latin America is not the Middle East. Abrams also has to contend that his murderous and nefarious tactics that he applied with the Nicaragua Contras is a world apart. So Nicaragua then is not Nicaragua now, nor is Venezuela. What is new is the superb solidarity of Cuba, of the wonderful Caribbean nations, and indeed all the non-aligned nations of the UN. What is new is that Venezuela is not alone in the world and has shown more dignity than this reputable Washington. And I'm going to skip all these other pages that I have. All of these, right? And I'm going to end with this last paragraph. And you can afterwards ask me any question about it. So they have completely misrepresented, misunderstood the political, the social, the historical context of Latin America. I just want to quote one thing. Simón Bolívar said on 12th of October 1818, fortunately, it has frequently been seen that a handful of free men have defeated powerful empires. And the great fact is that it is a revolution when the people make it so. When they stand up and defy empires, when they bear the brunt of the malice of empire and yet stand firm and defend their government, their revolution, their land, and their self-determination. Viva el pueblo de Bolívar y viva la patria grande. Thank you.
Hands off Venezuela!
Hands off Venezuela!
Hands off Venezuela!
Hands off Venezuela!
Okay.
So
that was great, Maria. I'm basically going to just
Move the mic up a bit.
try to put some, I guess, details on the quite incredible Canadian involvement in what looks like a failed coup effort in Venezuela. Hopefully, but increasingly looks like they are certainly failed in the short-term plan, and hopefully it's long-term. So hopefully it's going to be a very big defeat for Canadian imperialism. But we need to, I think, get a grasp of just the extent to which Canada is involved in this campaign. Yesterday, the day before, our Vice President of the U.S. is here in Canada, speaking with Justin Trudeau. What's one of the subjects being discussed? Venezuela. Justin Trudeau himself has called the leaders of France, Spain, Paraguay, Japan, Cuba, Ireland, Colombia, Italy, IMF, European Union to discuss Venezuela, and usually to discuss supporting the non-elected head of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, and the fact that Canada wants those countries to endorse him as the actual president of the country. Or in Trudeau's words, the international community must immediately unite behind the interim president. When there was the most recent failed coup on April 30th and May 1st, immediately when Juan Guaido, Leopoldo Lopez, and others tried to instigate the military to rebel, immediately you have Chrystia Freeland on Twitter making a statement, putting out a video calling on Venezuelans to rise up. Organizing an emergency meeting of the Lima Group, going down, I believe it was to Chile, a couple days later, to an second emergency meeting of the Lima Group. So you have just a level of diplomatic engagement that's really kind of striking. And this has been going on for years now, multiple years, where the Canadian government has been bringing up the Venezuela question with all the countries of Central America, with the Caribbean countries, particularly the Caribbean countries, where Canada has a great deal of power. Canada has been pressing them to join its campaign against the Venezuelan government, and it's quite astounding the amount of diplomatic energy that's been put into that and continues to be put into that. You have Canada bringing Venezuela to the International Criminal Court just over a year ago. Right? First time ever where a government member of the International Criminal Court brought another member to the ICC. So of all the human rights violations taking place in this world, the Canadian government has found that what's going on in Venezuela, or specifically the Maduro government of Venezuela, is the only country that deserves to be brought to the ICC in this kind of formal way. You have 4 rounds of sanctions. Right, illegal sanctions, and the most recent round just in April against Venezuelan officials. Now, the framing is that this is just against individuals in Venezuela. There was a assessment by a law firm, obviously working for Canadian companies possibly engaged in Venezuela, just put out recently, that showed how basically that this really isn't just about individuals. This has the effect of deterring all business between Canada, all relations between Canada and Venezuela. And you actually have a situation where I just found out that now Canada doesn't import any Venezuelan oil, whereas not many years ago actually imported a significant amount of Venezuelan oil. There's a report that came out that cited Canada as one of the countries that has seized Venezuelan assets. I don't have a whole lot of details about it, but there's been billions and billions of dollars of Venezuelan assets that have been seized in the US and Britain, I think in a few European countries, and Canada apparently has seized Venezuelan assets. That's something certainly that deserves a lot more attention. Canada played an important role, was really the founder of the Lima Group of countries opposed to the Venezuelan government about 2 years ago, because they weren't able to get the Organization of American States to condemn the Venezuelan government, mainly meaning that they weren't able to get the Caribbean countries to join their campaign against the Venezuelan government. And so Canada's has held 2 meetings of the Lima Group, Chrystia Freeland has gone to, I think, almost every meeting of the Lima Group, which has got to be approaching a dozen by now. as part of this, just a couple weeks ago now, Trudeau actually articulated the Lima Group's position vis-a-vis Cuba, called the Cuban president to articulate Lima Group's position vis-a-vis Havana. And basically, so Canada has increasingly taken on this role of putting pressure on the Cuban government to lessen its relationship with the Venezuelan government. The idea is that the only reason the Maduro government stands is because Cuban officials or Cuban security or whatever are propping up the Venezuelan government. So part of this is just a sort of propaganda exercise, and Canada's, by claiming Cuba, putting pressure on Cuba to break relations with Caracas, it's part of a propaganda exercise, but it's also part of something broader. And to the point where Canada has brought in what I understand is to be unprecedented policy, where Cubans can no longer enter Canada. The embassy in Havana no longer processes visas for Cubans who want to come to Canada.
Shame.
So Cubans actually have to travel to another country to get a visa to come to Canada, and this is part of a campaign to put pressure on the Cuban government to break away from its relationship with the Venezuelan government. Chrystia Freeland went down to Cuba, I think last week, again as top item to discuss was Venezuela, and putting pressure on the Cuban government to, as she put it, Cuba needs to not be part of the problem in Venezuela, but become part of the solution.
She speaks in cliches also.
So, Canada has been supporting the opposition in Venezuela, millions of dollars in recent years. This goes back at least since 2005, supporting opposition groups, opposition-aligned, so-called non-governmental organizations. It's hard to get a grasp of exactly the financial scope. I don't think the financial element is the most important element. That it's more of bestowing legitimacy on oppositional voices. So one of the ways they've been doing this is providing this Human Rights Award. For the last 10 years, the Canadian Embassy in Caracas has brought out a Human Rights Award to different NGOs, always oppositional NGOs. In Venezuela, and that award includes a tour of Venezuela for the winner, a tour of Canada. Usually, they get a fair bit of attention when they come to Canada, and the award gets quite a bit of attention within opposition-aligned Venezuelan media. If you look at the Canadian Canadian media, and you find the groups that are being cited for claims of human rights violations in Venezuela, you'll find a very close correlation between the groups that Canada has given the awards to, the human rights awards to, or a second prize, third prize, and those groups being quoted in Canada. So groups like Provea, Foro Penal, Codevidia, and others have been winners of the Canadian Human Rights Prize, and they're regularly cited in the Canadian media demonizing the Venezuelan government. Canada's former ambassador, Ben Roswell, was quite open about the ways in which he worked to build opposition to the Venezuelan government. He obviously framed it in human rights rhetoric, but this is what he told the Ottawa Citizen just after stepping down about 2 years ago. He said, quote, "We became one of the most vocal embassies in speaking out on human rights issues and encouraging Venezuelans to speak out." Right? So really pushing Venezuelans to speak up. Now, if you look at some of the groups, politically speaking, the groups that Canada has been supporting in Venezuela, you find that there's this real emphasis on Voluntad Popular, the political party of Juan Guaido, who's the self-declared president. And there's innumerable examples of officials from Voluntad Popular coming to Canada, speaking at different parliamentary committee meetings, going on tours, speaking at different conferences. Also, Ben Roswell, the Canadian ambassador, the Human Rights Award ceremony, it was the regular recipients have ties to Juan Guaido, Voluntad Popular's party. And I just did an article, I went through a whole bunch of details. So the Juan Guaido's phantom ambassador to the U.S. was in Ottawa on a number of occasions on these trips. Juan Guaido's his government's phantom government's ambassador to Canada, that's Carlos Vecchio in the U.S., and Orlando Vieira Blanco, same thing, being brought here over in recent years. This is before the recent phase, trips in 2005, as part of building support for Voluntad Popular and building support for this coup attempt. Leopoldo Lopez, who's the head of the Voluntad Popular party, Juan Guaido's party again, his wife, twice coming to Ottawa in 2014, and in meeting with Foreign Minister at that point, John Baird, and the head of the NDP, head of the Liberals at that time, and then also in 2017, Lilian Tintori, she came to meet Prime Minister Trudeau, and this I think would be kind of like the clearest example. This is in May of 2017. This is the clearest example of Canada fully getting on board this plan of appointing Juan Guaido or declaring Juan Guaido as a self-declared president, and really deciding that we're all in here for the coup attempt. Now, the Associated Press reported on Canada's key role in building international support for the Juan Guaido self-declaring himself president. The Canadian press said that Canada helped Guaido, quote, facilitate conversations with people that were out of the country and inside the country to building this process of trying to declare himself president. Freeland herself spoke to Guaido just before and encouraged him to self-declare himself as president. That's all been reported on. Now, this campaign, Canada's claims, Trudeau's claims for this campaign in terms of trying to oust Maduro is that this is constitutional, right? Now, they actually, one case to a public forum, Justin Trudeau, when someone called Hands Off Venezuela, Justin Trudeau actually went into the Venezuelan Constitution explaining how Article 233 supposedly allowed for Juan Guaido. So Trudeau became sort of an expert on Venezuela's constitution. It was really funny kind of watching the clips online. It's pretty quite funny watching. It doesn't say it at all, of course.
3 minutes.
And so, but if you look at, just to compare one example very quickly, the case of a member of Canada, the Canadian-backed Lima Group that's targeting the Maduro government is Honduras, and Juan Orlando Hernandez. His constitutional legitimacy is basically nil. The Honduras Constitution says clearly you're not allowed to run it a second time. Then, when he was losing the election, all of a sudden the counting stops, and when the counting starts again, he's ahead. I mean, it's a joke, right? Like the constitutional legitimacy is nil, and yet this is one of Canada's allies in the Lima Group targeting, again, under the claim of constitution. You see some of the language very similar. Freeland referring to this is our neighborhood. Trudeau's representative of the G7, Peter Boehm, told CBC, "This is our backyard, the Western Hemisphere. We have a role here." This is how they've justified it. This is very similar language to the Monroe Doctrine kind of language. Now, what's going on? Maria touched on it, some of it. I think the Canadian mining companies, why Canada's so into this is the Canadian mining companies very angry, not just with the nationalizations that took place, major multiple billion-dollar lawsuits that Crystal X, Resur Resources, a number of other Canadian mining companies have waged against the Venezuelan government, have won awards in international tribunals. So there's hostility on that level, but I think more generally the Canadian mining sector is very threatened by resource nationalism. There's tens and tens of billions of dollars of Canadian mining investment in Peru, in Ecuador, in Chile, in Mexico, and any move in the region to break away from neoliberalism with regards to resource policies is a threat to Canadian mining companies. So it's not just that some major assets have been targeted in Venezuela, but there's a more broader class concern or a resource extraction concern in the region. So I think that's an important part to explain it. Now to finish really quickly, we also shouldn't be totally surprised, right? Yes, this is extreme in how open and active Canada is in this effort at overthrowing a government, but there's a long history of Canada aligning with American efforts to overthrow social democratic or socialist-oriented governments in the hemisphere. I unfortunately can't get into that much detail, but from Jacobo Arbenz to Salvador Allende, Canada's a certain degree of complicity. More significantly, in more recent years, Manuel Zelaya in Honduras, 2009, fairly substantive Canadian complicity, and most clearly in 2004 in Haiti, when Canada helped overthrow Jean-Bertrand Aristide. In that case, we actually organized the meeting 13 months before the coup, where we brought the coup forces together just outside of Ottawa to basically plan the coup, or to consolidate the international forces. We had Canadian military, we had Canadian police, we had Canadian NGOs, aid, all of the Canadian foreign policy apparatus joining in on this clear overthrow of democracy, of a government with many problems put in place by the majority poor in Haiti. And so we shouldn't be shocked to see Canada doing something similar in Venezuela today if we understand a bit of our history of Canadian foreign policy. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Canadian domestic policy kind of says it all, doesn't it?
Sorry?
Canadian domestic policy says it all.
Oh, yeah, yeah. That's across the board.
I'd like to welcome everybody here, as Elizabeth has already done. We've had a really great conference. We've had a really great conference, lots of discussion, and I expect that we'll have some even more heated after tonight's presentations. As I just want to pick up what Yves, as he finished off, he said, we shouldn't be surprised at what happened. We shouldn't be surprised at what happened. It's what's happening in Venezuela. We shouldn't be surprised because the history of imperialism in Latin America, as it is throughout the world, has provided countless examples of how to win and how to lose. And that's what I want to speak about. How many here are fans, like I am, of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.? Anybody here? Okay, Christian. Right, okay. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is a TV series in which who's good guys and who's bad guys are sometimes obfuscated, but the real bad guys are this group called Hydra, and the Hydra emblem is the octopus with its tentacles everywhere. In Central America, imperialism is known as El Pulpo because imperialism has its tentacles everywhere. Politically, economically, socially, and culturally. And the objective of our organization, the objective of Progressive in Canada, North America, is to kill the pulp, is to kill Pulpo, to kill the octopus, to kill imperialism. Because we're at war. This is a war. And it is a question of life and death for millions and millions of people. This is not some abstract political debate. This is a question of how you defeat those small group of greedy imperialists and their lackeys and their agents in the countries of Latin America, and what is it going to take to win? Because that's what it's all about. That's what revolutionary politics is all about, is how, in this day and age, we defeat imperialism. And how we, what is it going to take to win? Well, history has given us some examples. In a war, you find out who your soldiers are, what's the relationship of forces, who are your allies, and who are your enemies. Well, the enemies are pretty clear. It's Canadian and American ruling classes, the ruling classes of Britain, of all the major imperialist powers who have their tentacles in this semi-colonial world, what we call the semi-colonial world. That is, countries who may have formal independence, but who are economically tied by change of dependencies to the metropolises, to the large capital capitals of capital, if you like. That's one enemy. Another enemy that we've identified, that history has identified, is the local oligarchies, the local national bourgeoisies within those countries. In Venezuela, it's pretty easy to identify one section of that bourgeoisie. Those are the people that who back Juan Guaido, back the MUD, back the parties who represent imperialism and who operate and might fight among themselves, but ultimately they act as agents of imperialism within their own national framework. There is another section which of the populations within Latin American countries, who play a role of one side versus the other, right? Who are not necessarily open allies of imperialism, but who, in the final analysis, will act that way. And we saw that, for example, in Chile at the coup in 19, where the Christian Democrat, the party of supposed democracy in Chilean democracy, ended up siding with Pinochet in that coup, which ended up killing 30,000 trade unionists and leftists, and just caused the mass migration of many, many, many thousands of others to countries like Canada. So in that history, in the history of this war, and it's been a war that's been going on since 1859, when William Walker and the filibusteros invaded Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and tried to establish a slaveocracy in Central America, and were defeated by the combined army. And it was the first and last time in which the Central American people provided an armed struggle which beat the filibusteros, which defeated imperialism, and ended up with William Walker being put up against the wall in Trujillo, Honduras, and in a moldering grave with a tombstone there. It's emblematic of the victory, but that was a long time ago. If we look back in the 1930s, the imperialist backed massacre in El Salvador, the death of Sandino and Sandinism in Nicaragua, and throughout that history of imperialism in Latin America, we can actually only point to one real victory. And that real victory was the Cuban Revolution. And if you examine the Cuban Revolution within the context of winning a major battle in the war, you have to examine what it was that won. What were the modalities of that victory which caused the Cubans to be able to stand up to the empire, to develop their real national independence, develop a social system, right, which feeds, clothes, and provides education and health care to its people at a much higher level than is actually the most of the working class, particularly the poor. 47 million U.S. citizens are living in poverty. 30% of all U.S. citizens, the children of U.S. citizens, are living in poverty. One can't say that in Cuba. The infant mortality rate in Havana is less than half of that is in Washington, D.C., as just one of the indicators. So why was it that Cuba was able to win, whereas for Guatemala with the Arbenz government in 1954, or Bolivia in 1952, or Chile in 73, or Bolivia in 73, and so on? What was it that caused the victory? And the issue came down to the revolutionary leadership of the people of Cuba and their willingness to deal with imperialism, stripped of any of its pretenses. The Cubans cut off the tentacles of the octopus. Fidel said, we're going to when the imperialists began to take actions against the Cuban people, Fidel and Che said, we are going to nationalize you down to the nails in your boot heels. And they did. That's what cutting off the tentacles of the octopus. They threw out the NGOs. They threw out those who were fifth columnists within the revolution. And they made no bones about it. There was no talk about, oh, we have to reconcile, or oh, we have to do this, or oh, we have to do that. They looked the octopus in the eye and cut off his tentacles. And that's what it takes to win against imperialism. As Eve said, we should not be surprised. But it's not just us who should be surprised. The political leaders in Latin America know what they're dealing with. I mean, Cristina Fernandez in Argentina knew what she was dealing with when the IMF tried to, and the vulture funds came in and tried to rob the treasury of Argentina. The Colombian political leadership, Duque and folks and all his predecessors, they know what they're dealing with, right? They're the clients of imperialism. They and their families are enriching themselves, right? Over the dead bodies of thousands of trade unionists and social activists and farmers whose land is being stolen, right? For the benefit of Canadian mining companies, Canadian oil companies, so on and so forth. And speaking of which, in Colombia, Canadian oil companies, former leader of the New Democratic Party of Saskatchewan, was the agent that dealt with the Colombian government. Because that is one of the enemies that we have to deal with. We have our own national bourgeoisie, and we have those who profit by imperialism in the trade union movement. And those who profit by in the trade union movement by imperialism actually profit to a great extent. And you see it within the Democratic Party, the Party of Labor. There's a certain layer who have lots of connections with Latin America and with companies in Latin America and use those connections for personal enrichment. That's one of the enemies that we here in Canada have to face. Because it's a war. I want to emphasize that. There is in the solidarity movement an attitude that if we're organized and nice enough that we can change the government position. No, that's not going to happen. What's going to take to change the government position is, on the one hand, the mobilization of more and more and more of the working class people in Canada, so that it becomes politically impossible, and we agitate around questions like hands off Venezuela, hands off Cuba, hands off Latin America, end the sanctions, right? Canada to the Lima Group, those kind of slogans.
3 minutes.
Okay? That is part of our job. But the other part of the job is supporting those who in Latin America understand that in order to win, you have to kill the octopus. You have to not temporize with it, not play games with it, not try to work around it, but to face up to the fact that until you take and expropriate and have the people of Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, all the countries of Central America, take back their natural resources, take back their political independence, take back through the force of arms, because that is what it's going to take. Until that happens, we will be still fighting the octopus. But the fight against imperialism in Latin America will lead to our liberation here in Canada, because we are entwined. And it takes a political organization, it takes solidarity, it takes the building of those kind of links with that kind of understanding in order to liberate ourselves. Because from the south to the north comes the permanent revolution. And the waves of class struggle, which are crashing up against the Fortress America, right? Well, our job is to help tear down the walls so the flood of that class struggle enters into our being, our politics, and helps us liberate as part of the liberation of humanity. So thank you.
Comrade Jeff.
Can you hear me, or should I hold the mic up?
Maybe hold it up.
How's this?
Fantastic.
I'm going to give a very unusual talk. Most of you have probably never heard before, at least part of it. It's going to jump around from different places, but it's going to say some strange things, but honest things. Socialist Action has a new pamphlet coming out with 3 or 4 articles by me called U.S. Hands Off Venezuela. Socialist Action is a leader and founder of the United National Anti-War Coalition. We had a demonstration 2 weeks ago in Washington of 800 people, Hands Off Venezuela, self-determination for Venezuela. We had a demonstration in Oakland where I chaired, and we had another 1,000 people. U.S. Hands Off Venezuela. For 10 years, and there's a reason I'm doing this, we were central in the United States to organizing mass mobilizations against U.S. intervention in Nicaragua, Grenada, and El Salvador. We spent 10 years of our lives organizing demonstrations in the hundreds of thousands, 100,000 in San Francisco, 100,000 in Washington, in every city across the country. We were invited by the Nicaraguan government, headed by Ortega, in the early 1980s to the first International Solidarity Conference. We were invited, and I went on behalf of my party. We were invited to Grenada by Maurice Bishop because we led the Grenada Solidarity Committee, which raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, as we did for Nicaragua. We wrote 3 books on Nicaragua. We toured Nicaraguans, including Omar Cabezas, who wrote Fire from the Mountain. I met with Jaime Wheelock, Daniel Ortega, and several of the central leaders of the Nicaraguan Revolution. They asked us to be the leaders of the United Front mass action coalitions, which we were for 10 years. Now, why do I say all this? Why am I bragging? I say this because our party was the harshest critic of the Sandinistas than any other party in the country. Because they didn't take the Cuban road. Because they thought they could coexist with Nicaraguan capitalism. They didn't nationalize the land and give it to the peasants. They didn't nationalize the factories of the country. They didn't establish institutions of workers' democracy. And as a result, when the imperialist beast came and Elliot Abrams and the Contras sought to destroy the revolution, the United States mined Managua and tried to bring down that revolution, Ortega lost in an election that his own government conducted to a right-wing pro-imperialist coalition in an election in 1991. The Contras were able to establish a base in the countryside because the Sandinistas didn't give them the land. It was only after the revolution was over and defeated that the Sandinistas held their first National Assembly. And their own self-criticism was our biggest mistake, was we didn't give the peasants the land. The Cubans gave the peasant the land on day 1. And when the United States said, we're not going to refine your oil, they nationalized the oil refineries that were owned by American imperialism. When the United States invaded, Fidel himself in a tank went down to the Bay of Pigs and led the opposition, where Cubans, 1,000 lost their lives, and they captured the entire US-financed imperialist army. And then Fidel, as Bob said, led the movement to nationalize the bourgeoisie in Cuba down to the nails in the boots on their heels. Or the heels in the boots, whatever. We were the first party when we were in the Socialist Workers' Party to visit Cuba. A comrade had a Piper Cub in Miami and flew down and met the leadership of the revolution. We were skeptical because Fidel was no revolutionary Marxist, contrary to what they write. Fidel was a member of the Orthodox Party, the traditional bourgeois opposition party, and he swore that when Batista violated the Constitution in 1941, he was going to remove Batista. He led a guerrilla struggle. He became a Marxist in the course of that struggle, but he made a critical choice. The only way he sought to defend, and when he marched into Havana with Che on day one, he said, we've gotten rid of Batista, I've met my obligations, and he appointed the bourgeois opposition to lead the country, including the presidency. And within weeks, that bourgeois opposition did not carry out the first program, first point, nationalize the land and give it to the peasants. And Fidel and his July 26th movement, which at that time was not affiliated with the Communist Party, the Communist Party opposed the revolution. The Communist Party considered Fidel some kind of Trotskyist, a permanent revolution. And Fidel threw out, with the July 26th movement, the bourgeois leadership and gave the peasants the land. That made the revolution real. The reason the Cuban Revolution endures today is because they took the socialist course. 10 years ago, we were all talking about Latin America on the left. Brazil had Lula. Ecuador had Correa. Argentina had the Kirchners. Uruguay. Bolivia had Evo Morales, and they threw in Daniel Ortega from Nicaragua. All those revolutions are dead. None of them took the Cuban road. We said they should. Imagine if they did take the Cuban road. We would have a socialist continent. They all tried to make, they wouldn't be isolated. They all tried to make peace. Lula lost his presidential election 4 times, and in the 5th time, he ran in a coalition alliance with the reactionary Catholic Party as his vice presidential candidate, and he won the election with the approval of imperialism, that he wouldn't go after bourgeois property, and his first act as president was to impose a massive austerity program on the working class of Brazil, including massive attacks on pensions and so on. A fundamental law of our history as revolutionary socialists and Trotskyists is you can't make a half a revolution. When I visited the leadership of the Cuba Cadre School in Cuba, at the invitation of the Cuban government, this is the fellow who was in charge of giving aid not only to Che Guevara when he was in Bolivia, but the Cubans financed and organized guerrilla fights in every country in Latin America except Mexico and Paraguay. He was in charge of it. I said, what do you think of the Nicaraguan revolution? He said, you can't make a half a revolution. But they didn't say that to begin with. Fidel, in speeches, which I've read, consented to if you don't believe me, they were published in The Guardian with regard to Nicaragua, urged the Nicaraguan not to take the Cuban road. And he said to the Venezuelans, he said to Venezuela before Chavez was in power, he was a guest speaker at a university, he said, don't take the Cuban road. And his explanation for that was that we had the good fortune to have the Soviet Union to help finance us. When they cut off the oil and closed the refineries, we got oil from the Soviet Union, which for its own reasons decided to support the Cuban Revolution, not for revolutionary reasons. There was nothing revolutionary left in the Soviet Union Not much anyway after Stalin, other than the fact that they were still a worker state based on nationalized property that didn't have a system for profit. So you ask, well, why did all these revolutions fail? Why do we have a neo-fascist type president in Brazil when we had Lula, the head of the Workers' Party? What happened to Evo Morales, who shortly after he got elected made extreme concessionary agreements on Venezuela's gas? They all went down. They were all put in the vice of imperialist encirclement, sanctions, CIA operations, NGOs, and everything else you could think of in the imperialist arsenal. I want to tell you a story of two revolutions. One was Cuba in 1958, one was Venezuela in 1958. You know about what happened in Cuba. Do you know what happened in Venezuela? It was ruled by the US-backed Perez Jimenez dictatorship.
That wasn't a revolution.
What?
That wasn't a revolution.
Well, a comment was that wasn't a revolution, but I'll tell you. Massive uprising in the capital. The army defected, turned over its arms to the people, and the isolated police and military who had captured the students in the medical school and put them in the police station, stripped the students, put uniforms on them when they were surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people, and marched them out with guns in their hands, and the population, armed, thought that they were the enemy troops, and they shot them down. And when they realized that they had shot down their own comrades, they charged into the machine gun fire of the last remaining vestige of the military dictatorship, and people died, and they took the people, the cop killers, and they tore them apart piece by piece. The army had disintegrated. The Communist Party was in the government. And what did this coalition Communist Party and bourgeois nationalists and others do? They sent to New York and they asked Romulo Betancourt to be the president of the country. Another bourgeois nationalist who was anti-communist. It didn't do anything. Yes, it wasn't like the Cuban Revolution, but the opportunity was there. All of Latin America was on fire. We start with one principle from the point of view of revolutionary Marxism: self-determination for all oppressed nationalities facing imperialist encirclement, attack, threats, embargoes, sanctions, drone wars, real wars, secret wars, and death squad wars. Even if these oppressed nations are headed by dictators, or with Trotsky in regard to Ethiopia, headed by feudal monarchs like Haile Selassie when they were invaded by Italian fascists. Self-determination of oppressed nations is a cornerstone of Marxist theory. It's the only way you're going to win the oppressed away from their own national bourgeoisie, who claim to be anti-imperialist. When Japanese imperialism invaded China in 1937, headed by the dictator Chiang Kai-shek, who had slaughtered our comrades, the Chinese Communist Party correctly joined the forces of Chiang Kai-shek to fight Japanese imperialism. And even when he refused to do so, and the Communist Party at the Hsian incident captured Chiang Kai-shek and said, for crying out loud, the Japanese are invading the country. And they got Chiang to promise to fight the Japanese and not the communists. Chiang agreed, and shortly after continued to fight the communists. But the Chinese Communist Party would never have won the solidarity and support of the Chinese people if they weren't in the forefront of fighting the imperialist beast. So Fidel has made mistakes. He's my hero. I know of no other modern day revolutionary who I have greater respect for. But he had a narrow view that you needed force like the Soviet Union. In the absence of the Soviet Union, you got to make a half a revolution. When I spoke to Omar Cabezas, who was comandante in Nicaragua, and I said the same thing to him, he said, and he he acted as if he was juggling balls in the air. He said revolutions are like magic.
3 minutes.
But they're not magic. They're not what the Nicaraguans try to do, satisfy some peasants by giving them some of the less arable land after they'd taken over bourgeois land. So now I get to the conclusion. I proudly stand before you and say we are the best defenders of self-determination of Venezuela. If we were in Venezuela, we would be joining with the Chavista army challenging all imperialist intervention. But Chavez and Maduro are no gods. 75% of the wealth of Nicaragua is in Venezuela is in private hands.
After 20 years.
After 20 years of a revolution, the bourgeoisie own the banks, the media institutions, the transport institutions, and virtually every other capitalist institution in the country. That's not socialism, comrades. That allows the bourgeoisie to drive a wedge between the working class, who are oppressed by capitalism, and the revolutionaries, and the government itself. So we have been, from the beginning, critics of the so-called pink revolutions, which were bourgeois, left, nationalist, social democratic led, but not of the Cuban variety, not our type revolution. And the only way we know of why you're here today to make a socialist revolution is to build a revolutionary party. So if we had comrades in Venezuela, they would be one among the best defenders of the country against every aspect of imperialist intervention and all their comrades in every other country in the world, as we are. But number two, they would try to build a revolutionary party, to organize the working class majority to take power in their own name and abolish capitalism. What else are we here for? We can't say Hugo Chavez is a revolutionary. I have many criticisms of him. He's a Christian revolutionary. He did wonderful things. He provided housing for 2.6 million people. He established missions that brought in education, healthcare, Cubans, doctors, wonderful things which he tried to do in the framework of capitalism. You cannot win in the framework of capitalism. That's why we exist. That's why we don't support any capitalist party anywhere in the world, and never have. So these are harsh lessons.
1 minute.
And hard to say. But the Nicaraguans and the Cubans, they respected us because we were the best defenders of their revolution. And they knew we were critics. We were comrade critics with the Cubans. We became their best defenders. They made a revolution. We think the Cuban Revolution is the best example since the Russian Revolution, the biggest land reform in the history of the world, and many other gains. But the Nicaraguans didn't take that route. And Ortega today is in an alliance with the Catholic Church and COSEP, the Council on Private Enterprise, and right-wing and others. He's a multimillionaire. He hasn't distributed the land. He started building an environmentally destructive canal across the country against the wishes of the indigenous people. And there's no semblance of workers' democracy in that country. All protestations, all acclamations to the contrary. Ortega is no revolutionary. I met him several times. I met him in Cuba at a youth festival. So I hate to disillusion you, but there's no shortcut to revolution.
Wrap up, comrade.
It's not an easy task. That's why we need to build a revolutionary party that understands the centrality of defending all of the oppressed and their right to self-determination, their right to form their own government, their right to make mistakes on the one hand, and building a revolutionary party at the same time in a constructive way to organize the working class in a conscious decision to challenge capitalism.
Okay, everybody's familiar with the format now, so we're going to open up the floor, and each person has 3 minutes, and we will take some questions and then come back to the panel. Somebody got your hand up over here? Oh, Miss Judy. Okay, go ahead, Judy.
As wonderful as Cuba is, and I was there at least 20 times in my life, I'd like to say that even Cuba could be defeated because it's just an isolated country right now, and you can't build socialism in one country, and you need at least a few other countries in Latin America, and Cuba knows that. That's why it supports anybody in Latin America that's half decent. But still, it needs a few good revolutions, as Chase said, before it can be securely socialist.
Christian?
All right, so it was sort of interesting because as we started with Maria and then we went on, it's like, I have this thought, and then the next person would kind of address part of it. It was like, oh, okay, that's good then, so on and so forth. So it's sort of been me trying to catch up. But I guess where I kind of, one thing that lingered that I find kind of interesting is I've been reading a lot of attempts on the hands, I guess, of the Lima group and its members or different people who might support it, to really try and frame Guaido as some sort of left-wing, oh, he's actually a very good social democrat, guys, don't worry. And I was sort of wondering where you, I guess it's interesting very sorry about that. I find it interesting that they feel the need to do that. And I guess what your thoughts are about how successful that's been and perhaps obfuscating the reality of the situation. And yeah, I've just found that interesting.
Is that a question?
Okay, just a minute.
Oh, I
Okay.
see. Oh, I see.
Yeah, we're taking a few questions, so if you can write them down. Barry?
Thanks very much. Well, this panel is titled Fight Imperialism. Why? I think it's chiefly two reasons. Because imperialism is a system that threatens the survival of civilization, the survival of humanity, the survival of our natural environment, due to its wars and perpetual plunder of the resources of this finite world. And two, because Canada is an imperialist state with internal colonies, indigenous people, Quebecois, Acadians, Newfoundlanders. I added that. On good advice. And Canada is an imperialist economy with external neo-colonies. Thanks to Barrick Gold, thanks to Goldcorp Corporation, thanks to SNC-Lavalin, thanks to the Canadian banks that operate and dominate the economies of the Caribbean and beyond. So we fight imperialism because the enemy of the working class is here, at home, in this country. When Venezuela is free of foreign intervention, we will be free. When Palestine is free, we will all be free. When the working class condones, tolerates, or supports Canadian imperialist aims abroad, it corrodes the fiber of working class solidarity. It corrodes our basic interests in the struggle against the boss class here and everywhere else. When Canadian Union leaders are indifferent to Venezuela's sovereignty, it is a blow against our sisters and brothers in Latin America and against our class here in this country. When NDP Member of Parliament Hélène Laverdière calls for President Maduro to resign and supports the reactionary Lima group and backs sanctions against Venezuela, it is a blow to working class solidarity everywhere. When Jagmeet Singh refuses to state that Nicolas Maduro is the president of Venezuela, he is aiding and abetting imperialism, and he's discrediting the only mass labor-based political party in North America. Socialist Action wants to see, as Jeff and others outlined, a socialist revolution in Venezuela, in Central America, and beyond.
30
Because
seconds.
that's the only way to achieve equality. Only a revolutionary Marxist party can lead that process. And it's up to the Venezuelan workers to build such a party and take control of their destiny. And our task in Canada is to get the boot of imperialism off the neck of the peoples of the South. What are we doing to that end? SA is part of the Toronto Venezuela Solidarity Coalition and similar bodies in Montreal and Winnipeg and British Columbia. When Chrystia Freeland denounces Maduro, we are the first to organize a picket outside her office on Bloor Street. When the CBC issues a stream of lies about Venezuela and its electoral system, SA is the first to propose a protest at CBC headquarters. We did this twice, last summer and again in February. I had the pleasure of attending the inauguration of Maduro in January. On my return, I approached my Toronto City Councillor and others to propose an exchange, Toronto-Caracas, on social housing and Venezuela's amazing world-class achievements in that field. We are dedicated to building solidarity with Venezuela. And if you believe in working-class solidarity, in socialist transformation, in a future based on peace with social justice, I urge you to join us. Thanks.
Hands off Venezuela!
Hands off Venezuela!
Hands off Venezuela!
Hands off Venezuela!
Okay. Aurelia?
Thank you. I'm Aurélien from the New Anti-Capitalist Party in France. And so Macron, the president of France, plays a great role in support of the putschist Juan Guaido. He was one of the first European rulers to recognize Guaido as the president of the Venezuela. France is at the forefront to support the putsch and to push the European Union to recognize Guaido as the new president in charge of Venezuela. Macron, who sends the police against strikers and protesters, pretends to be fascinated by the repression against protesters in Venezuela. Remember, the same Macron injured thousands of yellow jackets, thousands of youth, thousands of workers. Remember, a UN report concerned about state of civil rights in France. And the same Macron pretends to be preoccupied by the civil rights in Venezuela. This is not a surprise. This is because French imperialism occupies important positions in Venezuela. For example, Total, the main French oil company, has trained a lot of engineers and technicians in oil in Venezuela. This company owns shares in the mixed enterprise Petrocedeno, the company which operates in the largest oil reserve in Venezuela. So, I think this shows, as Jeff said, Venezuela is not socialism. The Maduro government is not a workers' government. Today, the Venezuela state owns only 30% of the economic apparatus of the Venezuela. Powerful capitalist groups operate in this country like Polar or Cisneros. So, as revolutionary internationalists, we are unconditionally against the imperialist putsch in Venezuela.
30 seconds.
The war against Venezuela is a war against all the working class in all the world. And so we must be the best defender of the oppressed nations. But we need to build a large united front to say, hand of Venezuela. But we must be clear. The issue will come from the mobilization of workers. Only the youth and the working class are able to fight the maneuvers of employers and imperialists with their method. Strikes, blockage of capitalist groups, demonstration. So we need to build a workers' revolutionary party. In all the country, we need to organize working class to stop the maneuvers of the imperialist government, to block the companies who send weapons in other countries to organize wars. So the destiny of the humanity depends on our capacity to organize the working class.
We're going to take two more speakers and come back to the panel. Corey?
Hi, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Russia and China. I know that they've helped Venezuela out a lot with not going along with the U.S. sanctions and the other international sanctions from Canada and Europe, and actually delivering medical aid and material aid to the country. But we can't be delusioned about Russia and China because, I mean, they're doing this because it helps them their own geopolitical position within this southern hemisphere of Latin America. It's not for the benefit of the Venezuelans or the workers. Yeah, so I wanted us to think about that, about Russia and China, and what they're doing there, because they also have grave human rights violations across the world and against their own working class in their countries. So I mean, we need to think about that and really build international solidarity with Russians and Chinese workers, not with their leaders. You know, I've seen a lot of praise for them online and from other people around the world. Anyways, I wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening in Colombia with the assassination of political activist leaders there. You know, that's going unnoticed, and that Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau they never mention at all the mass killings that happens in that country and the death squads that roam the countryside that are fighting against guerrillas that have, you know, FARC went to the table in the Dominican Republic with the Colombian government to stop the civil war. And so far, the Colombian government has thrown tons of FARC members in jail and basically has continued to persecute them. And so they found the need to go back into the jungles and continue to fight and to militarize the peasantry against Colombia. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and to talk a little bit about Haiti and what's been happening there over the past year, 6 months, sort of with the reigniting of protests and violence, and the Canadian forces on the ground there that have been seen in the media. Okay, thank you.
Okay, the brother right behind you in the blue shirt.
A little bit of background, I lived in Chile in '72, left 6 months before the first 9/11. I've done projects in Venezuela in the cement industry. I've done mining projects in Russia and in Venezuela. A few questions. Why should we consider the Chavez or the Maduro political system socialist? I agree with the last speaker on the panel. I would have classified Hugo Chavez's program as mildly social democratic. Second question, or third question perhaps. Is there an economic crisis in Venezuela now? I think there is. I haven't been there recently. But when you hear of inflation of 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, 1,000,000%, who caused that? I consider it was caused by a government of messers. Chavez and Maduro destroyed the economy. I was a founding member of in 2004 of the Ireland-Venezuela support group, because a few of us radical lefties in Dublin felt another coup by the US is inevitable. Well, now we have a situation where, as a result of the terrible mess that Chavez made on his program, which is not a socialism, the mess that they made of their economy, the United States empire does not have to invade. It did not even have to do what they did in September 11th, 73. Chavez, they destroyed the economy. They're handing it back to the right wing. So there's a lot to be said there. Now also, with regard to gold mining, I know a lot about it. Does anyone else besides myself, I'm sure you do, know how the people in the mining industry in the province of Guyana are mining
30 seconds.
Using mercury in small scale, terrible conditions, for years and years, families living on the edge of polluting themselves and the population. There were genuinely decent, modern projects run by capitalists, proposed by capitalist corporations, approved by the Chavez government for year after year after year, with well-defined technology to clean up all these sites, and they invested a lot of money. Chavez changed the mining industry once a year. giving his jobs to his cronies, ruined those projects. Then he nationalized them. Then they sued. He could have predicted this. They sued the government and the World Bank. They took billions from the Venezuelan government. Same in the cement industry. There was no need for them to take over and destroy the cement industry. The Venezuelan tragedy, of which I consider it, we should not accept that that was socialism. We should accept it as a terrible bunch of messers who has given socialism a black eye.
Thank you.
I wish it wasn't true.
Okay, so we're going to come back to the panel. I still have a list, so if you didn't speak, your name's on it, don't worry. So we're coming back. Each panelist will get 4 minutes to answer some or all, whatever they decide to do. We're going to start and come in reverse order now. Jeff, through to Maria. 4 minutes each.
Did you say 14 minutes?
Yeah, that's right, Conrad, because you'll take that.
Well, as you can see, this is a very important discussion and it's a debate that's taking place in the revolutionary left. I agree with Barry 100%. We all start with the proposition that Venezuela's self-determination is critical. In my view, the overwhelming crisis economically that's facing Venezuela is imperialist encirclement, embargo, blockade, assassinations, NGOs, and everything else you can imagine that imperialism does. And this is a monstrous collection of deeds. If none of these happened, Venezuela would be in different condition. It would be a reformist, social democratic country, but not socialist. But saying if none of this happened is the equivalent of saying if the sun doesn't come up tomorrow, I plan to sleep late. Because Venezuela does exist in an imperialist world. You cannot discount that. That's our obligation to challenge. No nation on earth, especially the Russian Revolution, they said you can't build socialism in one country. They said it's inevitable that we'll go under. We're going to have to try to survive until we get some aid for the German Revolution, from the Hungarians, from the Austrians, and from others. But we cannot continue, even in the largest country on earth, the Soviet Union, the sixth of the land surface, we cannot survive encircled, embargoed, blockaded, and invaded by imperialism. They sent 14 countries in to destroy that country. It was a weak imperialist power, and it defeated the combined forces of the world because it had the mass of people on their side organized in Soviets. We can't expect Venezuela to do miracles. So I do think it's a mistake to blame, like the comrade did, well-meaning, the economic crisis on a tiny isolated country. Now, Venezuela says that it owns its own oil. It has crude oil as its main product, and it can't get the crude oil that goes through its pipes because it's too thick. So it has to import U.S. dilutants, U.S. refined dilutants in Venezuelan oil to get it to the ships. And it has to depend on imperialist ships, imperialist refineries, and imperialist-owned virtually everything else in Venezuela. We used to say that Venezuela was Rockefeller's private island. That's where Standard Oil of New Jersey, which became what ExxonMobil, came from. The world's great powers want their oil back, 100%. So Venezuela had to make, now, if you make that move, let me tell you what it's like if you make that move. In my opinion, when Ortega took power, Batista fled, they made an agreement, but the generals in the in the Somoza army said, one more chance, we're going to just wipe out the Sandinistas. And they started killing tens of thousands of people. And the Sandinista people charged the last garrison into the gunfire, captured the entire army and had power. And at that point, I imagine the American ambassador, Jimmy Carter was president, went over to Ortega and the 9 members of the directorate and said, congratulations, you're now the government. And let me tell you, if you lay a fucking hand on any of our wealth, our land, our property, you can expect our death squads, assassination squads, terrorist squads, embargo squads to come down on you. That's the language they speak in private when the microphones are off. They say, keep your hands off our property, or will you embargo you like we did the Cubans for 50 years. Cuba would be a workers' paradise if it wasn't for it, but even then you can't have a workers' paradise in the context of a world imperialist system. So each and every decision these people, well-meaning people, including Hugo Chavez, who is a Christian socialist, a good person, wanted to do good. But under the heel of imperialism, he felt he couldn't do it. He did not want to cast his fate to the world revolution like the Russians did. Isn't our entire history people saying to the Russians, Bolshevik, you can't take power, this is a feudal country, there's no working class, only 10%. What the hell are you trying to make a revolution for? Go with the Mensheviks, set up a coalition government with the capitalists. We have a progressive bourgeoisie that is against the Tsar, supposedly, and you can have peace. And the Bolsheviks said, on the basis of Lenin and Trotsky and the party adopting permanent revolution, no, we can't make peace with the Mensheviks. They're continuing an imperialist war against us. They're continuing their colonies. They're fighting for the enslavement of the peoples of the world. You can't make peace with the capitalist class, and you can't make the revolution unless you give the land to the peasants. And the bourgeoisie said, but it's our land, said the Mensheviks and the others. What are you talking about? Just what they said to Fidel. They said, Fidel, we can't give them the land because it's our land. It's capitalist land. And Fidel said no. And when the people...
Time's up, Jeff.
Okay.
He must be getting tired.
Okay, couple of questions. First of all, is the relationship between imperialism and what it does in all the countries of Latin America economically, the tentacles of the octopus, right, and the actions of the governments of each one of the countries in relation to what the structure of the economic system, their own economies are, and that is the relationship of their national economies to imperialism. In the case of Venezuela, Chavez quite rightly knew what imperialism was about. It's not that he came to power with his eyes blindfolded. He understood what imperialism, and he had choices to make. Now, he didn't make a number of very fundamental choices at the start when the relationship of forces in Venezuela was great. When the pink-tide governments were in power all around with the exception of Colombia, but all the surrounding neighbors, including Lula in Brazil, and the creation of ALBA, and the creation of the economic integration mechanisms, which he had promoted, he relied upon the price of oil. That was first mistake. Second mistake was he integrated the oil industry. Foreign investment under Chavez increased in Venezuela, didn't decrease. It increased. In other words, if there were ties to the tentacles, the tentacle in Venezuela got larger. Those are economic facts. Now, with the price of oil falls, the primary commodity falls, obviously the national income is going to fall, right? That was a factor beyond anybody's control, unless you believe in conspiracy theories by the Saudis did it deliberately to screw Venezuela, which I don't think would happen, right? But at the same time, there were economic choices made by the Maduro government, which I don't need to go into, but if you want to see what those choices were, you can read in Le Monde Diplomatique, the last December's issue of Le Monde Diplomatique, where the former advisor to Hugo Chavez and the former spokesperson for Maduro lays out the economic case of the incoherence, and that's the word that he used, the incoherence of the Maduro government in trying to deal with the internal crisis. The incoherence when it came to monetary policy, the incoherence when it came to the question of how to deal with the black market, how to deal with the artificial price of the dollar, and how $10 billion of the national treasury disappeared from Venezuela, from the Venezuela, because of currency manipulation, and so on and so forth. So there's a dialectic there. It's not solely the problem of the fact that imperialism exists, as Jeff says, right? The sun's going to come up, imperialism going to exist, but it's also what people can do internally, what the government can do. Secondly, the question of that Aurelian raised, who's going to solve the problem? Well, I don't know if you saw on Telesur, if you don't watch Telesur in English, you really should, because it gives you a totally different view of what happens in Latin America. And I remember 3 weeks ago, Guaido is going into this working class area in Venezuela, thinking that he's going to be the hero. He's surrounded by the national police, by the way, right? He's being protected by the police. But the workers and the working class families, not just the whole working class families, came out on the street and chased his ass out of that neighborhood. And that's what happened. That's how. That shows the strength of the working class and the strength of the ideology and the determination of them to defend the gains that they have made and the independence and the understanding that Guaido is nothing more than a puppet of imperialism and they don't want anything to do with him. Okay? Right? You take that incident and apply it on a national level and apply it throughout that region, and you can see the strength of what happens. It is not the weakness of the national bourgeoisie throughout of the oligarchies. The weakness, there's not many of them, but they're all backed by US imperialism and they're all backed by the other imperialism. But when the working class of these countries go and chase these bastards out of there, off to their little hideaway in Miami or Fort Lauderdale or Palm Beach, whatever they go, right, where they can then be dealt with by the American working class pretty soon, right? At that point in time, that's how the economic crisis in Venezuela and throughout Latin America gets solved.
Thank you, Bob. Katie?
Yeah, well, one thing specifically with regard to the question about Voluntad Popular, they are clearly a very hardline party that represents wealth and extreme, but they did join the Socialist International, or the International Socialist. Socialist International. In 2014. I don't know the background to that. Maria might know that better. It's very interesting they would choose to do that. Like someone like Terry Glavin, who people might be familiar with, writes in the National Post, who has a left-wing background. He talks about them. He cites that when reporting on Juan Guaido as being from a left-wing kind of party, and so that is clearly used. It's much better from the standpoint of imperialism to give some left-wing credentials to those who were supporting than to not have those left-wing credentials. How much left-wing credentials one should give the Socialist International is a whole other question, but that that's how it's used. So yeah, I think with the NDP position of Venezuela, it's a really quite a terrible story. The fact that they have recognized that Barry mentioned. With Haiti, it was brought up the Haiti question about, this is where you see Canada's foreign policy. So we have a government of Jovenel Moïse in Haiti, whose electoral legitimacy is, I think it was 18% population voted in the elections. There was massive demonstrations in early February, the same time that Juan Guaido self-declared, and there would have been, his government would have been ousted, except for the fact that it continues to have Canadian and American support. Even most of the Haitian business class had turned really against the government. But you know, this is part of our ally in fighting Venezuela, and you know, so we talk about legitimacy. Now, you know, the gold question I think is interesting. I think that I don't know enough about how the Chavez government dealt with mining to be comfortable in having a full sort of analysis of it. I am of the principle that it shouldn't be up to Canadian companies to own the resources of another country. I don't think it's acceptable that the resources of the Congo or Venezuela or whatever are sold on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Now, but then you do get into real questions about, well, okay, so, you know, I don't think most of these resources, gold, for instance, should just be kept in the ground, right? So we get extractivism in and of itself is a bad thing. You know, imperialist ownership of natural resources is a bad thing. Extractivism is a bad thing, and I agree with you that if you pursue extractivism in an incredibly ecologically and socially damaging way, in some instances it can be better to have imperialist ownership of those resources. You know, so those are real questions that need to be discussed. Now, with regard, in like a bigger question of imperialism, and I'm obviously very sympathetic to the idea of sort of hardline opposition to imperialism, but I mean these are difficult questions that a government has to deal with in terms of. There are questions of you know, yes, you want to break the back of capitalist power and imperialist power, but if in that process you destroy lots of people's lives that are not, you know, not just the, you know, sliver of capitalist owners, then that is obviously very socially damaging.
One
so
minute.
those questions do have to be dealt with, and to go back into a you know, Haiti. Thing that you know is a real debate within Haitian activists that I've organized with. You know, people like Toussaint Louverture. Like Toussaint Louverture is someone, you know, famous Haitian revolutionary. He's actually somebody who's criticized by lots of people in the Haitian community. It's Jean-Jacques Dessalines who's the great revolutionary because he's, you know, Toussaint Louverture ends up dead in a French prison. He wants to have an alliance. He wants to have a relationship, not a total break from French domination. Whereas Jean-Jacques Dessalines, his motto is, you know, cut the houses and brûler les maisons, and basically, you know, drive all the whites out, cut all the, you know, destroy the property. And I think there's a real debate. I'm obviously sympathetic to Dessalines' position, but there is a real debate in terms of what the you know, the some of the social effects that policy. Obviously, if you're forced into it, you're forced into it. But I think that those kind of discussions have to be debated. And in the case of the Venezuelan government, many problems from their management. I don't personally think that my main criticism would be that they try to operate in a sort of dual accept capitalism while moving away from it. I don't know that is. I think that's something. Yeah, something that needs to be debated.
Okay, Maria.
Well, I can say that I am here also representative of the Venezuelan people because I am Venezuelan. I also belong to the group of professionals who are Bolivarians and very, very connected to the PSUV. And so I would like to speak with their voice right now. I hear a lot of people here talking about they respect the self-determination of Venezuela, but I don't see much respect when Venezuela self-determinates in a particular way that somehow doesn't fit with certain, you know, frameworks. So are you going to let Venezuelans decide for themselves what type of government they want, what type of socialism they want, or are you going to stand out here and point out and say, oh, that's not according to the book? Well, I'm afraid that's not respecting the self-determination of Venezuelans. And I also want to say that two great men of the world, not just Latin America, were Chavez and Maduro. These men have put their life on the line, and they have transformed a country that was absolutely poor amidst the bounty that foreign peoples had come and robbed us of our resources and have turned it into what it is now. I don't think any of you have been in Venezuela. I don't think any of you have been in the marches, the streets, street after street after street, full of workers. Yes, workers. Not bureaucrats, but workers and campesinos and women and indigenous peoples, and they have taken the streets of Caracas over and over and over again these last years. And these last 20 years of Bolivarianism, do you think Maduro and Chavez were sitting there, looking at their papers? You know what happened in Venezuela? That the people became what Paulo Freire said, concientización. They became conscious of who they were, their identity, and what they wanted to do, and their political savvy, their political consciousness. I have had political conversations with people in the slum areas. I've got 3 university degrees, and I can tell you, I have had political discussions with people who live in the slums who are much more intelligent and articulate than anyone I found in the universities. So yes, the Venezuelan people are conscious, they are political, they are socialist according to Bolivarianism, our type of Bolivarianism, which may not be the North American, the Canadian, the American. One of the things that surprises me is that these cosmopolitan left-wingers of North America and Europe and wherever, who have so much disdained President Chavez and President Maduro, who have derided the Bolivarian revolution because it did not have, an Uzi in its hand, it did not follow exactly what the Cubans did, because it not fits with their narrow Eurocentric theoretical framework. I asked them, why haven't you made a revolution in Canada, in the US, and in Europe? Why are you going on about Venezuela when you should be here doing your own revolution and leaving us doing our revolution as we are? And the other thing I wanted to say is, as a Venezuelan, I stand here and I thank Cuba. I thank Cuba so much. We have so many Cubans helping us, sweating with us, crying with us, all along these 20 years. If Cuba doesn't have a problem with Venezuela, why the hell do you? They have been our greatest friends, the Cubans, and they have stood with us at every critical moment, the Cubans and the Venezuelans, not just the governments, but actual Cuban peoples and workers and all sorts of people working with Venezuelans. So I want to say to you, Venezuelan oil is nationalized. What they did was, and it wasn't Chavez, it was nationalized before, but what Chavez did was said that all the foreign investment, which we need, folks, because we don't have all the capital in the world, has to be shared, so you have to have public partnership like you have here. The land has been fully given to the campesinos. The campesinos are fully on the side of the government. And I want to say this last thing. Who decides what is socialism? Is there one socialism? Or could there be many socialisms? So I say to you, Viva Venezuela, and what we're doing, I am tremendously proud as a Venezuelan, what we are trying to do.
And you should be proud.
Thank you.
Viva Venezuela!
All right. Maria, we're not, thank you.
There's more?
You can do it again! You can do it again!
Started.
She's ready to go to the pub. So that's a warning. You all better be very brief. Maria's smoking. Okay, you ready to sit?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Maria, for your very, very wise words. I am a South American, and I have a few things to say. They might not be very popular here. I'll say them anyway. First, I want to thank the comrade that said, that quoted that you cannot make half a revolution. Yes, you can't. You have to make a whole revolution. However, you make a whole revolution, or you make a revolution when you can, and the same Conrad said, how was Cuba able to win? Because revolutionary leadership and their willingness to deal with imperialists. Now, I want to talk about, I can't see with my glasses, I can't see without them, but I want to talk about South America and the governance of South America and what was here called pink socialism, okay? And also I'd like to, I thought something that Maria said. I find it really difficult for me as a South American from a country, Brazil, that has people in the streets like we'll never see here in Canada. Has people in the street crazy protesting. Has always had people in the street before and after, crazy protesting and trying to change things. You know, I find it really difficult to listen to my adorable and respectable comrades here, American comrades, saying to me with the typical American arrogance that how we should do it in Brazil and how we did it wrong. Yes. You know, while the whole thing was happening in Brazil, the whole coup d'etat that was happening in Brazil, the party that is supported by both Socialist Action and the International Socialists, the PSOL, was doing all they could to screw with the Workers' Party so they can get a little piece of power for themselves. You know, instead of helping, instead of joining with the left, they were just doing their own thing. You know, so that was really sad. I'm trying to see with my glasses. I would like to say that the United States has hardly any left-wing power. You know, the United States has always been governed by monsters, you know, by horrible people that never did a thing for the workers. And I understand it started there in the First World War when everything got despoliticized, when the Americans were so afraid of the Russians and all that stuff. I know that story. But what I say is the Americans never did a revolution. You know, they never did. The Canadians are the Americans' lapdog. They never did any friggin' revolution. You know, so why am I here listening that Lula had launched that, first of all, got in bed with the right wing. Yes, he did. And I'll tell you, Lula, Morales, all the people in Argentina, in every country in South America wouldn't get there in any other way. Second, Lula, yes, he did. He launched some austerity campaign, and then he lifted 48 million people from poverty in Brazil. Come on, you know, come on, give me a break here.
Who was it?
Elizabeth? Well, Maria, those were very powerful words you spoke at the end. And I think perhaps the tone of this meeting, we haven't concentrated enough on saying what the good things that the Maduro government and the Chavez government have done, when we do know them. We do know that he, out of the blue, he gave pensions to people, and that he's made reforms to the health and education industry, and has made a lot of public housing. Yes, we must say that they've done a lot of good things, but what we're critical about is because we don't want to see them fail, and we don't want it to go backward. And we are big defenders of Canada and the U.S. not intervening in Venezuela. We invite the Venezuelan and the Cuban consuls to come and speak at our meeting. We support the independence of these nations. But we do have some critical things to say. And I'm going to talk about just three things very briefly. One is in the oil industry. I have been to Venezuela in the year after, it was about 10 years ago, and I went to Colombia the next year. And I saw that they were selling their oil for 1 cent a liter. That was a mistake. You can't sell a natural resource below the actual labor value that goes into it. Not that far off. They're selling it for 1 cent a liter. The next year I went to Colombia. I was at the closest big city to Venezuela. I was in a cab and it took me down a back lane. I said, where are you going? I'm getting gas. And they came out with liter tanks of gasoline. It was Venezuelan gasoline that had been, because of corruption, buying it 1 cent. Somehow it had been making its way to Colombia on ships, and I'm sure with the connivance of many people, I saw that happen. You can't sell your oil at that cheap, even domestically. That it was a mistake. The banking industry as well. They've made mistakes in the banking industry. They should have taken it over completely many years ago. They're suffering death by 1,000 cuts these last 20 years. And they've made mistakes in their currency controls and how much money they've been printing. You can't add a zero every week to a bill and run a country. So
30 seconds.
They have made some mistakes, but we do support all the gains that Chavez and Maduro have made. Thank you.
Chris W.
Hi, I have a kind of a naive question to ask. I live in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada, and I listen to The Current with Anna Maria Tremonti on CBC Radio. Her coverage of Venezuela is vastly different from what you might hear, say, on Democracy Now! Or from what I read in as the Socialist Action publications, the emails that we get. It's like day and night. It's like black and white. It's amazing. And what I'm hearing here, it's just a completely different perspective. So it's important to me to kind of understand where the sources of our information are coming from. And when I'm hearing different perspectives, to be able to check those perspectives with the facts, if I can. And it almost seems like we all have to be investigative journalists to some degree, our own investigative journalists. Although we can depend on one another, I guess, to a certain extent. So my question is just simply, where do you get your information? Especially Eve Engler, if you've published like 10 books, I mean, this must be a constant question that you have to wrestle with, is how do you get your facts? And what do you folks suggest for us in terms of just being able to decipher the vast amount of information that is out there?
Okay, I have 3 speakers left. I have 3 speakers left on the list. Yes, I have you, and the sister here, and Gary. So anybody else that hasn't spoken?
I guess we're not going.
Julius,
We got the pub all night.
Just a second, keep your hand up. Julius, and who else did I see?
There's some people.
No, over on this side. There was somebody here on this side. Rosemary.
Not a hot discussion.
Over here.
Okay, all right, so now we are coming to this side. I have the sister here and the brother there. Okay. So the list is now closed because it is already 5 after 9. We've got a bunch of speakers and then we got to come back to the panel. So keep your pens busy because I'm going to go through all the speakers before I come back and then give you all time to answer, and we will be starting with Maria and going back that way this time. Okay, so now let's get to my list. The sister here.
Yes, I have a concern with the recent 3-day meeting in Ottawa led by Justin Trudeau, supposedly to protect democracy when it comes to social media, and going to make the big companies financially responsible for misinformation on their, on their whatever, online, I mean. So, but isn't this a very cunning way of actually censoring the truth? Because he also said that authoritarian governments might misuse this to censor the, but we are always hearing BS, from our leaders. So, so it's really such hypocrisy. And if they're going to make company, and the sad part is they're exploiting the mosque shooter in New Zealand to get this done, you know. So that's a concern I really have, because you know what I hear and what I glean from reliable sources. I would say reliable, like Michael Hastings, God bless him, the journalist who was so-called died in a car crash, brand new car, and then his body was cremated before it was given off to his parents. So you know you got to think about that. 33-year-old who wrote that wonderful revelation about General McChrystal in Afghanistan, who Obama sacked after he said that we've been killing so many enormously large number of people who were no threat to any of our soldiers, and nearly in every instance a family was injured or blown up in the attack, so-called going after terrorists. So that's my concern. And number two, in response to this he's not here. Pardon?
He was never really here.
Okay. So he spoke something about China, and well, it may be because for their own interest in Venezuela, they've been helping. But I come from Pakistan.
30 seconds.
I come from Pakistan, where for years, Pakistan from its inception went from being a British colony to American, puppet state, and because of the military bases there and all that. And I know when we had a president, a prime minister, the first one who actually wanted to turn away, from the West imperialism, he was, done off, and Islamic dictator was installed. But this guy wanted to he organized something called the Regional Cooperation for Development with China as a partner, because he said that China went through the worst, after the Opium Wars, for 155 years, it went to such
wrap up,
humiliation, And I remember once one of my friends saying that the Chinese, their one child policy and all that, was so mean. And I quoted a priest who came to I come from a family of 10, and this is very personal. And my father really was finding it so hard to make ends meet. But the priest would come to our house all the time and say, we are Catholics, we need more children, and this is God's will. And he had to beg, and poor man. So that's the extremes,
Okay, sisters and brothers, comrades, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 6 speakers. So please, please, please don't take any more. If I tell you your time is up, or you got 30 seconds, because otherwise I'm going to have to not get to all the speakers. Okay, and I don't want to have to do that. So, sister right here in green. Right here.
Oh, that's not here.
Oh, here. Oh, I thought you had your hand up earlier, sister. No? No? Okay, sorry about that. Okay, go ahead. Yep, it's fine. It's fine.
Hi. I have a question to start with. I look around and I don't see the future generation, the young. Except for the future. Okay. You're not that young. I'm talking about the young and get them involved. How do you go about this? Who is talking about
Okay, everybody.
I'm talking about younger than this. I'm talking about high school kids. How do you get them involved? They're so disconnected. They are so disconnected, and especially in Canada or in the US or in Europe. They're so disconnected. Maybe in Europe more involved than here. But here they're so disconnected. How do you get them involved? How do you get them off their chairs and start getting involved in all of this? And talking about the panel, you seem to be very well informed with Venezuela or the South. I haven't been there, so I cannot really talk much about it, but I do listen to different stations. Actually, I'm disconnecting from the stations that that broadcasts from here. I do not turn on the TV. I totally disconnected because it's all lies. And I'm more tuned to Lebanese stations or Arab stations because they're more balanced, I find them. You obviously have information about the South, but you don't have the same kind of grab on what's happening in the Middle East. And when I hear yesterday somebody talking about Assad, that he is sorry, what was the question? How did you describe him yesterday?
That was yesterday. We're not going to get back
Anyway,
into that and start an
so
argument. Sorry.
I feel that you lack the balance of really knowing what's going on there, and especially if you're fighting for the Palestinian issues.
30 seconds.
You cannot be fighting for Palestinians if you do not know what is really happening down there, and if you do not know who is really in control and what they're doing, and if you cannot be fighting for Palestinians if you hate Iran. Iran did not do anything bad for the Palestinians. Saudi Arabia did. The kingdoms did. But Iran did not. Iran is backing the Palestinians. You cannot be pro-Palestine if you think Hezbollah is against Palestine. Hezbollah is backing Palestine. And the same with Assad.
Okay, sister, your time's up. Sorry.
That's it.
Okay,
And thank you, Maria, again.
Thank you. Okay, Gary.
It's not black and white though. It's not black and white. You can have the right perspective on one issue, but the wrong perspective.
I understand Maria's reaction. If I were a part of the Bolivarian movement, I would have had perhaps the same reaction. I know that we here get criticism from revolutionaries in Latin America. We've had criticism of our NDP orientation here as not being revolutionary or being questionable. And what we try to do is clarify it. But, that's what revolutionaries do. They don't just support each other, they also offer to exchange opinion. You ask, what revolutions have we made? We haven't. But as was pointed out earlier, the only one that's been successful in Latin America is Cuba.
That's right.
So there's been a lot of massive struggles and a lot of heroism, and in some countries for some periods of time, very large gains. But then it gets thrown back because imperialism has always won, and what we're afraid of is that they will win again in Venezuela. So if we offer what we hope is seen as fraternal criticism, that's what we're trying to do. It's the same way we accept criticism from revolutionaries in Latin America. Now, I understand that we come from the metropole and you come from a semi-colonial country, and I understand
You
that
think
can be
Canada's not semi-colonial?
No, we're not. We're very much an independent imperialist country. We're just not the big one. But
Please, Maria, please.
But so I understand that it's maybe tough to resist feeling put upon by that kind of criticism, but I ask you to at least consider what we're saying and not reject it out of hand. Who knows, maybe it'll help save the revolution.
Okay, Julius.
Great presentations. For me, I'm surprised that many reformist organizations around the world are not stepping up to defend the reforms that have been won in Venezuela. I mean, that's what I see as, in the Socialist Caucus and left in the NDP, when we fight for reforms and the significant reforms that the Bolivarian Revolution have won, we actually use that as an example, as an argument to say, this is something that, that we can aspire to. They did it in Venezuela. Why can't we do it here? And so when American imperialism threatens Venezuela, it's not just an attack on Venezuela or Latin America, it's a threat to all workers who are fighting for reforms. And we support reforms, but we don't rely on reforms. As has been said, reforms can be brought back. Right now, we're in the middle, it seems like there is, once again, a heated fight that is emerging on choice, right? This is absurd, that we are once again getting pulled into this fight. And why is that? Because the right to choose, which was won through struggle, in a sense, is a reform, because we have not had a revolution. And so the right wing is pulling that right back. So it's like, there's a cartoon I saw, Reform or Revolution, right? You have, on the one side, you have a couple of guys sitting in a bus. It says revolution on the front, and they're all waiting there. Leaves when bus is full. And on the other side, you have a carousel of people cheering, going in a circle, over and over again, saying, what? Why would we join you? We're going somewhere. They're going in a circle. So I say this, I think I'm out of juice here. I say this in jest, but there's a political point to what we're trying to say as well. Our criticisms are constructive. We want the workers to win. We want another example for workers around the world to look to, besides Cuba. We want something even better than Cuba. That's all I'll say.
Okay, Rosemary, right there.
So, I have a question for Comrade Jeff. When you, first of all, the first time you spoke when you gave your speech, you ended it by saying that you think we need a revolutionary party, a socialist party, and we shouldn't compromise or sell out. We need to build a party, and that your hero is Fidel, because he made a whole revolution, even though he made mistakes here and there. Made a whole revolution and not a half a revolution. Second time you got up and answered to questions, you applied what in French we would say is a numerous bémol. The little you talked about why various revolutionary situations there were compromises made, and one that sticks in my mind most is in Nicaragua, where private conversation was, if you touch us, bourgeoisie said, if you touch us, you're going to get the full force of the CIA, the death squads, etc., etc. So interesting kind of schizophrenic kind of position you have. Now, the schizophrenic in the way that we used to think of it. It's not really what schizophrenic is. It's a split personality, I guess. Variation of schizophrenic. Hollywood schizophrenic, yeah. So the interesting what you said also, well, you said we need to build a revolutionary party. My question to you would be, give us some examples of actions that would do that. I found it interesting that the sister for the student movement talked about the need to actually, or why was Doug Ford so popular? Because he's seen in the neighborhoods, and the leftists aren't. They don't seem to. I don't know. They're sort of like living like the revolutionaries in the Life of Brian, where they're, Mary Magdalene comes in and says Jesus is being crucified, and they say, just a minute, we have to clarify this very important theoretical point, right? So, what specifically would you give us some examples of how we would build a revolutionary party that would actually stick and actually do things? Because I think it's important that we have an action plan rather than
30 seconds
about correctness or non-correctness of the various actions by other governments. And I thank you, Maria, for telling us off. I had a conversation with John Orrick driving to the session last night, where I was criticizing him about pontificating about about how Cuba, this and that was not right. So where the fuck are we to tell the Cubans when they've survived 60 years with their heads, with their faces shoved into the anus of the empire, you know?
Okay, so the brother here in the back is the last speaker.
It's a good analogy.
Good evening, everyone. I'm glad we have a good panel here tonight, and I'm not going to be long, just want to ask one more question.
Could we have one meeting, please?
This is to the Maria. I'm glad you stood up for your country as a true nationalist. And, you know, it's obvious that we all make mistakes. And, of course, Hugo Chavez, the late Hugo Chavez, and Nicolas Maduro, we're all humans, we make mistakes, you know, but, you know, in earnest, we try to do best. Just wondered about when you mentioned that idiot Elliot Abrams, you know, which not everybody's familiar with. He was orchestrated the death squads in Nicaragua. I guess he got backing by CIA and the State Department in the USA. But he was actually charged, I believe he was brought before Congress, and he answered, and he was found guilty or whatever, just, I don't know if he went to prison.
No, he was pardoned.
He was pardoned, yes, okay, I wasn't sure. And also the word was mentioned on Leopoldo Lopez. He's actually considered to be true opposition before Juan Guaido. Is that correct?
He's the leader of the voluntary.
Pardon?
He's the leader of Voluntad Popular. Yes.
She will get back to it.
Okay.
The comrade will answer you when
Okay,
your
that's
turn
all.
comes.
Sorry.
Thank
It's
you.
okay. Is that it? Okay.
And he's a criminal.
There you go. So there you go. It's a segue into, because you're the first speaker and you have 4 minutes, and we'll go down the line. Each person has 4 minutes to wrap up. That's all the questions. And then you can go to the pub, Maria.
With us. Yeah, not by yourself.
Buck a beer.
Have 4 minutes.
I'll be crying to
Bring your own if you want.
So you want to know why the economy of Venezuela is what it is? It's because not any mistake that President Maduro or Chavez may have done. I agree that, you know, they're not perfect. I don't know which government is perfect. Do you know of a perfect government? Do you know of a perfect president anywhere? If so, let me know. So what has happened right now is the sanctions. The sanctions since 2014 that the United States and its lackey allies have done to Venezuela. Sanctions are war. It's like a medieval siege, okay? And those people who want to be, they want to be progressive, like the Democrats in the United States who say, oh, well, we're against military, intervention, but go ahead with the sanctions. You know what they caused? They caused 40,000 Venezuelans to die. And these were the most vulnerable. These were children. These were chronic people who were chronically ill. These are people who needed desperately medicines, which we cannot buy. We've got the money to buy, but we're not allowed to buy medicines in the international market, some of which cannot be obtained except through big pharma. You know what has happened? Out of 12 boats that have come to Venezuela with food for the basic bag that is given to people twice a month so that they are not starving. There are 12, 10 of them have been stopped because of the sanctions. So the United States is stopping medicine and food to come to Venezuela. And the United Nations human rights rapporteurs, both of them have said these are a crime against humanity. And you know why they're a crime against humanity? Because they aren't collateral damage. You drop a bomb and somebody walked by and they died. Oh, sorry, we didn't mean to drop the bomb on you. You were collateral. No, this is directly aimed at the civil population, the civilians. And that is against the Geneva Convention. And this is very important. One of the things that I wanted to talk about here, that what is new in this new imperialism that we see, is that it is trashing the international law that since the Second World War has tried to keep the peace. So this is the Geneva Convention, the Vienna Convention, this is the UN Charter, this is the OAS Charter. All of these have, with impunity, been destroyed, trashed by the United States and its horrible allies, including Canada. So why is Venezuela, with this tremendous inflation and all of that? Yes, sure, there was, corruption, and there was selling of gasoline on the border. We know these problems. These are small issues compared to the fact that Venezuela, with all its oil, cannot sell its oil. That Venezuela has been its monies, its gold, its assets have been stolen, pillaged, robbed, pirated by the United States and by international banks. They have not only simply said, oh, we're not going to process this money that we have sent in order to pay for the medicine, instead of we'll give it back to you. Oh no, they keep it. So this is the new imperial piracy that is going on right now. The robber barons were kindergarten stuff compared to what they're doing now. And all the nations, Canada too, all the other nations and all the other corporations, you watch for this, because Venezuela's Citgo, the oil company that Venezuela had in the United States, was robbed, stolen, pillaged, taken over by the United States, and its money used to fund the opposition, and guess what? Pay the international debt so that they don't suffer from all of this. So I'm sorry if I feel a little bit strong about this, but I don't quite understand or accept that Venezuela should be robbed and pillaged in the way it is, and that the world is standing by and not saying anything about it. So whatever failures in the economic administration of the government that may have been, have nothing to do with the situation, the economic situation that Venezuela is now. All the force of US capitalism has fallen on top of Venezuela.
Well, in terms of like the facts question, I mean, there's on Venezuela in English, Venezuela Analysis, Telesur, useful. I mean, there's many different websites. Things in Canada, things like Canadian Dimension, Rare Patch, Rabble, Ricochet. I think those are useful.
Gray Zone.
In the US, maybe the Intercept, I'm not that familiar with the Intercept, but Counterpunch, ZNet, Dissident Voice, I think are useful media outlets. Palestine, Electronic Intifada, Mondo Weiss, useful Palestine Chronicle. So there's lots of stuff. In terms of like on a personal level, I mean, there's now international media is just, I have Google News searches for Canada, Guatemala, Canada, Palestine, Canada, Venezuela, Canada, Honduras. I get these announcements. So in terms of access to information, it's pretty easily accessible. One thing I think that is amazing when we talk about like reformists here in Canada, so like the NDP, one of the biggest issues we have right now, obviously in Toronto, is accessible housing, social housing. Well, one of the quite amazing successes of Venezuela that's still, despite economic downturn over the past handful of years, still succeeding in doing is building incredible amount of social housing. But it's amazing how you just can't even say that publicly. Like even at the left end of the NDP, you wouldn't really want to make any link between the social housing question here and Venezuela. But it's viewed as very marginalizing as a Nikki Ashton wouldn't make it, Sven Robinson wouldn't make it, right?
We're making a new party.
So, yeah, I mean, in terms of like Russia, China, I don't like, we obviously shouldn't be blind to Russia and China's oppression domestically elsewhere, but we do have to think in geopolitical terms to a certain extent, right? And having non-U.S. geopolitical powers is something that's important, and I don't know how, like, personally I feel uncomfortable about going all the way in, for instance, with Russian policy in Syria. I don't, dropping bombs from the sky almost as a universal rule is something that I don't like. Now, in the case of Syria, in recent years, Russia dropping bombs, these are sort of complicated questions that we have to keep in mind the geopolitical context and geopolitical blocks against the U.S. and so I think that those are a couple of things I'm interested. Just to conclude, in terms of young people, 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, I forget exactly, there was multiple thousands of high school students on the street in Montreal in I think it was the 14th week of weekly student strikes on the climate question. I don't know. I mean, so it's clearly it's not that there's no young people that are engaged in activism. We have a political culture that teaches us at every different level to not be engaged politically. So it's not just a question for young people, it's I think more general, but there are examples that we can point to of I think ecological questions, climate questions where young people are engaged. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I want to say that we have wonderful discussion here. We have political differences with Maria Paz. She has a political viewpoint. We have a political viewpoint. We're expressing those viewpoints. What we can do, despite the fact of those differences, is unite in struggle. As the sign says, hands off Venezuela, hands off Cuba, hands off Latin America. We can do that together despite our differing opinions of where and what we are in the process in terms of the Venezuelan revolution, what's happening throughout Latin America. Soy tico, yo vive en la corazón de un clase trabajador en una ciudad de Costa Rica. I'm a Costa Rican citizen. I've lived in the heart of a working class city in Latin America. My wife got fired by Scotiabank 5 years ago. She was a financial assessor. She had a mortgage that Scotiabank owned. When she got fired, after 11 months, they tried to kick her and the 4 kids that were living in the house out on the street. This is a reality that people and workers in Latin America face on a daily basis. We know what imperialism does. It's not a abstract question. It's not an abstract question of us in the metropolis, right, telling Venezuelans what to do, but our comrades in Venezuela put forward the same analysis. They disagree with the political line of the PSUV, as an example. But they will work with every working class organization in Venezuela to defend the Venezuelan people's right for national self-determination. And in fact, they make that the heart of their politics. Anti-imperialism is the heart of the struggle for socialism. Simple as that. In the day of imperialism, finance capital, imperialism being its highest form, right? The struggle against imperialism, despite whatever political differences that we have, is the primary struggle. And we believe, because we believe that through that struggle, the working class will take power and build the socialist future for the peoples, not only of Latin America, but for North America as well. And that socialism is not the kind of socialism that Sweden has, which is social democracy. It's not the kind of socialism that the Ba'athist regimes in the Arab East said. It's a different kind of socialism because it's based on the power of the working class to run their economy democratically without bureaucrats and without bosses. That's what our differences are.
Okay, just to clarify, what is self-determination? It's a term that has one meaning. It's you defend the right of an oppressed nation against imperialist intervention in all its manifestations. Regardless of the leadership, we support self-determination. It's not true that we reject self-determination because we don't let the Venezuelans do whatever they want to do as a people. The Venezuelan people are divided by classes. We're not neutral, and we don't have self-determination for classes inside Venezuela. We're for the rule of the working class through its own institutions, not the capitalist class. We are for the abolition of capitalism. Second, is there just one view of socialism? Yeah. Socialism means the collective ownership of the means of production by the working class achieved through socialist revolution. It doesn't mean a government that says they're socialist, social democratic, or democratic socialist like Bernie Sanders or DSA who supports capitalism. It means the institutional rule of the working class, no other class. The 99%, not the 1%. With all the sources, I write for Counterpunch. They've printed 20, 30 of my articles. The Electronic Intifada is supporting me for President of the United States. Its associate editor, Nora Bowers-Friedman. I know all those sources. There's not one source in the world that has said that the Venezuelan people own the land or that there has been any land distribution of significance in Venezuela. So we have a factual difference.
That is a fact.
We know that Cubans gave the land and the Nicaraguans didn't. That was central to losing the revolution. When you found a contradiction in what I had to say regarding Nicaraguans had to compromise, I didn't say they should compromise. I said that's what the imperialists tell them, not what they should do. If they said, get the fuck out of my country, we're going to take it over, give the land to the peasants, and nationalize you down to the nails on the heels of the boots of your shoes, we would have said right on. Fidel knew exactly what he was doing. The United States said when the masses went to the stadiums and they put the butcher Batista agents to the wall and 10,000 people voted, you raped my family, you murdered my son, and they had public trials. And they said, al paredón por los terroristas, to the wall for the terrorists. And they shot them down. And the American ambassador said to Fidel, you have to have law and order. You have to have civil liberties. You have to have a fair trial. You have to send the Cuban army into those stadiums and arrest those people who were shooting down the mass murderers, Batista's henchmen. Fidel refused. He knew that he would get the wrath of imperialism, like when he gave the land and nationalized everything. He cast his fate to the world revolution. That's what none of the pink revolutionaries did. It wasn't a mistake by Lula to run with a right-wing, reactionary, anti-abortion, sexist, racist, pig vice president, Catholic leader. That wasn't a mistake. He made a decision. And his first act was to impose a massive austerity. When our comrades said no, and they were members of the Brazilian Senate, they voted no for the austerity, he expelled them from the party. We don't do that. That's a matter of principle. Self-determination includes the right of oppressed nations to seek aid, including from Russia and China. We fully support Syria's right to ask the Russians and the Iraqis and the Iranians and Hezbollah to support their right to exist. And we support the right of the Venezuelans to do it, and we do not oppose it whatsoever, regardless of our views of all of these countries and their politics. We're no Putin supporters, but that's included in the right of self-determination. It means also that we have an obligation, physically, we're in those countries, to fight on the side of the oppressed, invaded nation, which we would do in Venezuela. We're not neutral on that question. doesn't mean much when you say, if Cuba doesn't have a problem with Venezuela, then why should we? That's not a fair question. The Cubans support the right of all oppressed nations to self-determination, from Syria to every nation on earth oppressed by imperialism. That doesn't mean that they agree with their social system. They're a socialist society, the other's a capitalist. We support the Cubans because they're an inspiration to the world of what socialism can look like. Is Venezuela beleaguered? I oppose every aspect of the sanctions, and as I said, I think they're responsible for 90+% of the horrors. None of it would happen if it wasn't, but it would still be a capitalist country, and you can't make peace with the capitalist class. The bosses are not going to make peace with the workers, and the workers are not to accept capitalist rule, capitalist ownership of the land, capitalist ownership of the bank, and capitalist control over the oil. So these are all central questions which we need to debate honestly. We can't run away from them. We have different opinions. But as Barry said and everyone else said, when it comes to mobilizing our own working classes against imperialism, we are united like a tight fist. We have been central to organizing for my lifetime the mass mobilizations of millions from Vietnam to Iraq to Cuba to Latin America, to every one of the 250, 300 interventions by imperialism. And our comrades are no cosmopolitans. We're an international party with revolutionary fighters in 65 countries on earth. We were murdered by the Shah. We were imprisoned. The government of the United States put the entire leadership of our party in prison during World War I. We're the first victims of the Smith Act. We led the major strikes that led to the CIO. We're not cosmopolitan, and neither are we arrogant Americans. Trump is an arrogant American. The ruling class are arrogant Americans, every bourgeois politician, but not the people who spent one lifetime fighting capitalism and imperialism and suffering for it. Each and every one of us. I was blacklisted from every school, witch hunted out of teaching for a long time. 9 times I went to prison. I'm not an arrogant in the civil rights movement. I was a supporter of Malcolm X when everybody said he was a racist in reverse. And we published his works and marched with him. We were there when he was assassinated, defending him on the defense guard. We're not arrogant Americans, we're revolutionary fighters. And that's what you need to make to challenge and defeat the world's greatest imperialist power. Not a pussycat party, not a compromising party, not a party that makes friends with the capitalists or runs in coalition governments or supports them in elections or allows them, when you have a chance, to cut them off from the control of the means of production. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. And now our Central Secretary, Aaron Whitewater, would like to close the convention. The conference.
Sisters and brothers, comrades and friends, did you enjoy this session?
Yeah!
Did you enjoy this conference?
Yeah!
I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart coming to this conference, for sharing with us all your ideas, your enthusiasm, your passion, your commitment to fight for change, because this society and this world is headed in the wrong direction, and only people like us, not only us, can make this correct, can fix it, can save civilization and humanity, and have a future worth living for all of us. Another thing can be said about this gathering, and that is, another thing can be said about this gathering, never a dull moment. And one more thing I'd like to add. There's an old aphorism. When everyone thinks alike, nobody thinks much. We believe in debate. We believe in democratic dialogue. We believe in fighting for our ideas, even fighting with our best friends sometimes, but fighting against the common enemy. And that's what we are resolved to do coming out of this conference. I want to just add one more thing in conclusion. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Socialist Action, Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste, will be hosting its Pan-Canadian convention in this room. And I'm saying this to a room of people, of members and non-members and friends and first-time visitors and all of the rest of that. Socialist Action is proud of what we do. We don't claim to have a monopoly on the truth, and we don't claim to always get it right, but I think we're correct more often than wrong, and that's why we have such good friends with whom we debate respectfully. Socialist Action is proudly one of the initiators of the May 18th, first and not last, Pan-Canadian Day of Action for Palestinian Rights. Socialist Action is a founding organization of the NDP Socialist Caucus. Socialist Action is a founding organization of the Workers' Action Movement, which is fighting to establish class struggle democratic unionism in unions all across this province and this country. And Socialist Action is continuing to do the things that you have seen, not that we just talk about, but that you have seen us do all across the country in building solidarity with our sisters and brothers around the world to bring the working class to power everywhere we possibly can in the shortest, fastest, and most peaceful route imaginable. If you're interested in helping us to build this kind of party, here and in alliance with our friends from around the world, we invite you to talk to us as you leave and make a plan to join us, to come to the convention tomorrow morning and see how a democratic organization plans for the next 12 months making the revolution in this country. However long it may take, we can only do it if we work together. Thanks very much. Hope to see you soon.